My name is Jamie Grove. I work here at Hendrix in our Employment and Graduate School Connections office, and I'm also chair of the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar program here at Hendrix. And I'm just really excited to have you here. I don't think a lot of people realize that this is really a unique opportunity to have a Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar come to our campus. It's something that we have to kind of ask for every year, and we've been very fortunate for the past several years to be selected by Phi Beta Kappa to have a scholar come to our campus and to share their expertise, their research, to talk with students and faculty during their 2 days here. We're really fortunate this year to have the scholar that we do, and I think it's a wonderful coincidence that he was scheduled to come at the kickoff of Campus Kitty Week, which I know has the theme of poverty this year. So that was a fun coincidence and something I was happy to hear. But I am very, very honored to introduce our speaker, who is David Grusky. He is from Stanford in the School of Humanities and Sciences. He's also the director of the Center on Poverty and Inequality, the California Welfare Laboratory, the Recession Trends Initiative, and co-editor of Pathway magazine and the Studies in Social Inequality book series. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, recipient of the American Sociological Association's Max Weber Award for Distinguished Scholarship, founder of the Cornell University's Center for the Study of Inequality, and a former presidential Young investigator. His research takes on such questions as whether and why gender, racial, and class-based inequalities are growing stronger, and how such differences are best measured. And so tonight, we're going to get to hear what his solution is to poverty.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction. And I want to thank everyone for such a warm welcome here. I've been welcomed in a way that's unusual, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to talk, as was said, about how one might go about ending poverty. Before I even get to that, though, I want to persuade you that this is something that we should attempt to do. And there's lots of reasons why one might argue we ought not take this on. And I want to march through some of those conventionally advanced reasons as to why we ought not worry all that much about poverty, and persuade you that those conventionally advanced reasons aren't on the mark. So, for example, sometimes it's argued there's no real poverty in the U.S. Let's take that on and ask whether or not indeed there is. It's sometimes argued that it's not all that bad being poor because money can't buy happiness. Let's look at that and see if that's a persuasive argument. And then sometimes it's argued that poverty is an inevitable byproduct of running an efficient economy. It is just the price we have to pay if we're going to run a high output economy. I don't want to take that argument on as well. So let's start with whether or not there's any real poverty in the U.S. There's lots of ways you can ask and answer that question, but here's one that I think is useful. You can draw on the Pew Global Attitudes survey. It's administered comparably across the world, so heads of households are asked this question: have there been times in the last year when you did not have enough money to buy food your family needed? And here are the responses among the rich countries. You see in the United States, almost a quarter of heads of households said that indeed there were times in the last year when they didn't have enough money to buy food for their family. And this compares rather strikingly with what prevails in other rich countries like Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Japan. In all those countries, at most they have about half as many heads of households indicating there were times in the last year when they didn't have enough money. And in fact, we look not like other rich countries in our responses to this item that indexes one type of poverty. We don't look like other rich countries, but rather we look like other far less developed countries, more like Poland and Argentina than say France or Britain or Canada. So something special is happening in the U.S., something special that entails very elevated levels of poverty, and we'll talk a bit about why that would be the case. So the next question that might be taken on is whether or not we ought to care all that much about poverty. And in particular, if everyone can be equally happy, rich and poor alike, then perhaps it's not something about which we should trouble ourselves too much. Here's some evidence that's relevant to that question, and here it's the Gallup Health Waste Survey listed in 2013, and then presented by the Brookings Institute. And what they did was they asked folks whether or not in the last day they experienced pain, worry, sadness, stress, or anger, and then compared the responses across 3 categories. Those who were poor, earning less than $20,000. Sorry, 2,000, less than 2,000 per month. Those in the middle class and those who were rich. And what you see is that if you're in the poor category, you have elevated levels of pain, worry, sadness, stress, and anger, quite substantially elevated levels. And so the simple point is that, maybe it's not a surprise, but that poverty is bad for the poor. It's bad to be poor. Now you might say, well, okay, it's bad for the poor, but what about for those who aren't poor? Is poverty also bad for folks who aren't poor? And so Harry Holzer and a team of other economists examined that question in terms of the economic costs of poverty for the country as a whole. And what they found is that if you must look at productivity and economic output that's foregone, so just the sheer, simple, straightforward, narrowly drawn economic cost of poverty, the country loses about 1.3% of gross domestic product per year by virtue of economic output that we don't have mainly because the poor aren't working at the level that they'd like to work. So within California alone, which is going to be the area in which I'm going to be developing a plan to substantially reduce poverty, within California alone, that implies a loss of about $26 billion a year. That's a big price tag, and that doesn't even take into account all sorts of other externalities like the extra crime that arises by virtue of running a high poverty regime, or all the health costs, which are substantial and profound. Ignoring all those costs, just the sheer narrow economic costs, it's clear that everyone's paying the price of running a high poverty regime, not just the poor, but everyone, poor and rich alike. So you might think when we have a big high-cost problem in play, a problem that in many respects is far larger than the types of problems that you hear about in say, the current presidential debates, a huge, big problem with massive externalities and costs. You might think we'd have a game plan, at least a plan on the books about how we take this on. So if we had, for example, an infrastructure that's in disrepair, or highways that are in disrepair, we have a plan to go about and ultimately get to implementing that plan and be done with. But right now we have a labor market that's in gross disrepair, huge costs in play, huge, massive costs that are in play by virtue of running a poverty regime that generates far more poverty than in other rich countries in the world. So something very special happening in the U.S. It poses huge costs, arguably larger costs than any other problem we have, and yet basically nothing. Nothing's happening, right? Occasionally plans are released and ignored, but by and large, it's just evidently fine to go forward as is. So then you might ask, well, why is that? Why is such a massive problem and poses such large costs on of course, the poor themselves, but everyone else as well? A big drag on the economy, all sorts of externalities. Why is it that we don't do anything about it? I think there are a lot of reasons, but one reason I think is that we believe that it would just be too difficult and complicated to take poverty on. The causes of poverty are very, very complicated, not well understood, and so at this point, the best we can do, by this logic, the best we can do is study the problem more and try to figure out that magic bullet solution that will allow us at some point in the future at least to solve this problem of poverty. So it's like a disease for which a cure hasn't yet been found, and all we can do at this point is to fund more research. Now that's great for folks like me. That's what I do. I carry out research on poverty. It's a full employment policy for people like me. But I think the argument is utterly and irrevocably off the mark in that we already know what causes poverty. There's an extraordinary body of evidence in play that makes it clear what it is that's generating poverty, and it's just not that complicated. It's pretty simple stuff. And so I want to ask why we think it's complicated when in fact it isn't. And I think we get confused in the distinction between the causes of poverty and the consequences. The consequences of poverty are, I confess, very complicated indeed. Causes simple, consequences complicated, and that's what I think is confusing us. So let me demonstrate that point with what I call the pollution metaphor. And so what I want you to imagine is there's this upstream mill that's dispersing pollutants into the stream that runs next to the mill. And then imagine also that there's a city that's downstream. And that because of that pollution, there's a health crisis in that downstream city. So you can imagine all sorts of health problems are arising, maybe asthma, cognitive dysfunction, depression, a big list of problems that are being generated because of the pollution. So what do we do when that happens? We take what I would call the downstream approach. So we first off hire some epidemiologists to demonstrate that indeed there's a causal relationship between the pollution that's being emitted and the health problems that are in the downstream city. Then we of course have lots of physicians that are now treating all the health problems that arise because of the pollution. We have lots of clinicians who are instructing the population about understanding the symptoms that they're likely to experience. We hire loads and loads of extra special education teachers because of the cognitive dysfunction that's arising because of the pollution. We have social workers to disperse the benefits because lots of people can't now work and so need to survive in some fashion through social programs. We of course hire lots more police officers because there's going to be rising crime rates now in this city that's ridden with poverty. And we're going to have more prison guards too, because of course we'll incarcerate by virtue of all this extra crime. So it's a really complicated response machinery that's set into motion by virtue of this pollution. Now if you don't like this complicated response, there's another way you could go. It's a pretty simple one. You just reduce the pollution, right? So is this a contrived metaphor? I don't think so. I think it's pretty much exactly what we do when it comes to poverty instead of pollution. So what do when we run a high poverty regime as we do in this country? Well, we hire, first off, my favorite one, we hired lots of social scientists who are asked to study endlessly, ceaselessly, the effects of poverty, the consequences of poverty, how people are harmed by poverty. We again hire nurses that are responsible for assisting folks in understanding all the health problems that arise from poverty. And poverty does generate loads and loads of health problems, and that's been documented. We of course then also need to hire lots of physicians to treat the health problems that arise because of poverty. Again, we have lots of social workers because we have to disperse benefits if you're running a high poverty regime. Again, you have to hire lots of police because there's going to be more crime when you have a high poverty regime as we do. And then, of course, you're going to incarcerate like crazy, which is our #1 anti-poverty policy. And so that means you're going to hire a lot of prison guards. So again, it's a complicated response. It's pretty much the same as the response that plays out with respect to what happens when you take a downstream approach to pollution. Now again, if you don't like that downstream approach, you could go upstream. You could just repair the institutions that create unequal opportunities and reduce poverty. That's just another way to go. And it's very simple. In fact, there's many ways to proceed by way of this institutional repair. And I'll lay out at least some of them. So what I'm going to do is lay out this upstream approach. I know we want to take the upstream approach. We want to take on poverty in a way that we've never before taken it on. We don't want to treat the symptoms. We don't want to treat the causes. We want to do it right. But the devil's in the details. There's lots of ways that you can undertake an upstream solution, and we have to, I would argue, get it right if we're actually going to do this. And I should say that this is leading up to what's going to be a proposition in California. So what I'm talking about isn't just academic talk. There's going to be an initiative of the sort that's based on an effort to do a serious upstream response to poverty. So if we're going to do it, and we're going to do it again, we absolutely have to get it right. Why? Because we fought a war on poverty about 50 years ago. It's typically understood as a war that was failed. In fact, a lot of things that was that were done in that war on poverty were done right. We learned a lot of things, but it was a bit of a seat of the pants war. We had no evidence to speak of on which to base the decisions that were made in relatively short order as to how to fight that war. And it's understood, I think, mainly unfairly, but it's understood as a failed war. We cannot fail again if we're going to undertake this effort again. If we fail again, it may well be another 50 years before we get another shot at it. So we really have to think this through carefully and make sure that we get it right. So I'm going to have a bit more by way of precursory discussion before I get into the absolute details of what I think we need to do. So first, let's talk a bit about the backdrops that are relevant to trying to craft this upstream approach to poverty. I think there are two main backdrops that absolutely must be kept in mind. One is very well known, that's rising income inequality. If you've been asleep for the last decade or so, perhaps you missed this, but what's happened is that we now have this spectacular takeoff in income inequality over the last 30 to 40 years, such that the top 10% of the distribution, of the income distribution now controls about half of total income. And so we now have a level of inequality in which this top decile is controlling half of national income, a level of inequality that's roughly what was in play during the first Gilded Age about 80 years ago. So from here on in, we're entering uncharted territory with respect to levels of inequality. So that's important, and we'll talk more about what the implications of that are for any anti-poverty plan. But there's another force in play, I would argue, besides rising income inequality, that's every bit as important, and that's rising commodification. And I want to talk about that a bit. So what do I mean by rising commodification? Here you have to bear in mind that there are two ways that goods, services, and opportunities can be distributed. One way is, of course, to distribute them on the basis of those who have money, so you can buy them on the market. That's a very conventional way to distribute goods, services, and opportunities. But another way is simply to make them a prerogative of group membership. So it could be, for example, that everyone who's a member of a certain country gets automatically some goods, services, and opportunities. There are two ways, right? So rising commodification is just all about increasingly relying on money as a way to allocate goods, services, and opportunities, right? So we use the market mechanism. Now, if I'm right, and I'm going to lay out the case for this, if I'm right that there's rising commodification, what that means is that the poor are disadvantaged now in two ways. They're disadvantaged in the sense that they have less money in relative terms to the well-off. That's what rising income inequality means, right? So they have less money than others. So the poor are disadvantaged just because they have less money, so they can't compete very effectively in securing goods and services and opportunities that are on the market. But they're also disadvantaged because increasingly they need money to buy goods, services, and opportunities. That's what rising commodification means. They have less money and they need it because more stuff's been put on the market and has to now be bought. So let me give you an example of rising commodification, an example about which we don't really care in and of itself at all, but it will illustrate the principle. And then I'll talk about how it applies to poverty in a more direct and meaningful way. So we're going to talk about airline travel. And when you buy a ticket, it's sort of like becoming a member of a country. You can think of it as being born into a country. You bought a ticket, now you're part of say, United Club or Delta Club, American Club, right? So now you're a member, you're in the club. And so how then are all the amenities within this club dispersed after you become a member of that club? Well, in the past, there were a lot of public goods. You know that as soon as you became part of United Club, you're getting a snack. Done deal. You're going to get a meal. Done deal. You're going to be able to check your luggage and you're going to be able to watch a movie. All part of the package. Now, of course, if you want those things, what do you have to do? Money on the table. What about lotteries, the decline of public lotteries? Well, it used to be that if you wanted an exit row seat, you could just be lucky. You might just check in early or at the right time or line up at the right time and you get that exit row seat. Or the same with the bulkhead seat. But now, there's no lottery for these things, right? The lottery's been eliminated and it's just a matter of spending the extra money so you get that more desirable seat. So we have the decline of lotteries, the decline of public goods, a very unimportant example of this. But now let's apply these processes that I think are in play across the board across a variety of fronts, apply them to the case of opportunity. So what I'm going to argue is just as with the airlines, we have the decline of public goods in many, many ways, but I'll give you just one example. We also have the decline of public lotteries. Again, in many ways, but I'll just give you one example. So let's start with public goods. So one thing that we know from this research on poverty is that early childhood education is immensely important. You have high quality early childhood education, it will advantage you tremendously going forward as you enter the labor market and beyond. So there's just a big payoff to it, okay? Well known. So one of the big developments of our time is a shift in who's doing childcare. It was once the case that you could be guaranteed, pretty much by virtue of being born into this world, guaranteed that you get high quality, dedicated childcare by a loving mother. That was the way it worked. So it's a public good of some sort, right? And now, of course, what's happened, and it's all good stuff, right? We have the increasing opportunities for women in the formal labor market, and so increasingly women are in the formal labor market. Of course, the bad part of this story is that now requires usually two earners in order to get by in this world. So increasingly, if you're going to get high quality childcare for your children, increasingly, and this is what's shown in this chart, increasingly you're going to have to go out on the market and buy it, which is absolutely no problem. If you got a lot of money, you just go and buy that high quality childcare, right? But what if you're poor? You don't have any money to buy high quality childcare, and so you're in trouble, right? And so you're at a disadvantage. It used to be the case that all kids would get high quality caregiving. Now it's been marketized, and so you've got to put the money on the table, which is a problem if you're poor. So that's the decline of public goods, just one example, but it's a consequential one. Here's another one. Now we're talking about the decline of neighborhood lotteries. Another well-established result is that it really matters where you grow up in terms of your opportunity to get ahead. Some neighborhoods are very advantageous, in particular because they have high-quality public schools. It used to be the case that some poor kids won the lottery and were able to live in these high-amenity neighborhoods with very high-quality public schools. So my own neighborhood, Palo Alto, is one such case. In the past, there were some apartments that were within the range of the working class. So you could luck your way in to those apartments, even if you're a poor family. You basically won the lottery. You won the lottery because your children would now be able to attend very high quality public schools of the sort that are available in Palo Alto. But that was then. Now, Palo Alto is just for the rich. There is absolutely no way, if you're poor, that you can live in Palo Alto. It's well beyond your range. And that's happening across the country. The rich are living with the rich. The poor are increasingly living with the poor. There's rising economic segregation. And basically what that means is there's no lottery anymore if you're poor, in terms of having any chance to live in a high amenity neighborhood where your children will be schooled in high quality public schools. That's not happening anymore because there's much more segregation, economic segregation now than in the past, which basically means poor people live with poor people, which means that you do not very often have the high quality public schools available anymore. So there's a disappearance of the lottery and opportunity. So what we have here is two examples of training that once was more nearly equal, but now has been put into the market. You got to buy early childhood education, or you got to buy entry into a very fancy neighborhood that comes with it, high quality public schooling. And so now opportunities in the market. You've got to buy it. And if you have any doubts about neighborhoods mattering, here's a chart by Raj Chetty, my colleague at Stanford, which characterizes neighborhoods in terms of the probability of reaching the top quintile from the bottom quintile. So what are your chances if you're born into the bottom of the economic distribution of making your way to the top? There's dramatic variability across neighborhoods. I believe we're...
You're close.
Geography is not my strong suit. So it's not good. We're in we're in the red zone. And so your opportunities here. Now, of course, this is not nearly as detailed as you'd like. There are, of course, going to be neighborhoods within this bad red zone in which there are lots of opportunities to get ahead. So this is a grosser representation of neighborhoods than, of course, you'd like. But the general point is there's great disparity across the U.S. in opportunities to get ahead. This is linked in large part to public schools, but other sorts of amenities for which there's now no longer any water. Okay, I think I've made the point. So that's the backdrop. I'm done with backdrop. Now we're going to get to it, okay? So the key question, based on that backdrop, is how do you build policy in a commodified regime, okay? Deeply commodified, of course, high income inequality. The poor have less money relative to the rich than ever before, and they need money to buy opportunity for their kids. So we got a problem. How are you going to solve that problem is the question. And I'll lay that out, but we're going to do it for California. California is a great test case because it's got the highest poverty in the country if you measure poverty according to a supplemental poverty measure, which is considered the best poverty measure that's available in the United States. There's about a poverty rate of, well, it's now a little lower, but I think it's about 21% in California, higher than any other country. In this case, the poverty threshold is between 23 and 30,000 for a two-child family. It varies according to where you are in California, depending on the cost of living in particular county in California in which you live. So if it's a high cost of living county, then the threshold is just up there. So we have lots of poverty, and we want to know how we want to ask how you're going to take care of that poverty when we have extreme income inequality and commodification. And there's basically two ways to go. You could say, okay, commodification is a done deal. It's with us. We've got to live with it and adapt to it. And that means we have to somehow deliver money to the poor. It takes money to buy opportunity for your kids. That's what commodification means. We put even opportunity in the market. And you need money to deliver opportunity to your kids. Give them high quality early childhood training, to buy high quality public schools for them. All the things that are necessary to give them opportunities. It takes money, so we're going to have to transfer money to the poor to make that happen in the context of a commodified society. That's option one. Option two is to decommodify. So let's think about which one is going to pay off, is going to work. Now, I should say here that what we're aiming for is a proposition in California that will pass. So you can put together a proposition. As long as you get enough signatures, it takes about $5 million to buy enough signatures, which is about money. You have signature people go around and they get paid and they'll collect the signatures. If you have $5 million, you get a proposition, you can get on the ballot. And then it takes about $50 million to win. So if you have $55 million, you're good. It isn't much in California because there are a lot of rich people who are willing to fund things that they think are the right thing to do. But you do have to get people to vote for it, right? And so in putting together this plan, there are two main considerations. You want a plan for which the evidence is very, very compelling. That is, only programs that have been demonstrated to have high payoff and to work. Because you're going to run a campaign truthfully and honestly on the argument that these are programs that have been shown to work. And you have to be ironclad on that. So it has to be evidence-based programs. And it has to be ones, among all the wide array of evidence-based programs, it has to be ones that people actually will vote for. Right? So there are two conditions that have to be met. You actually want this to happen. Okay? So, bearing that in mind, what about option one? So option one, remember, is you say commodification, done deal, nothing we can do about it, and so we have to make it work. And that means transferring money to the poor. Okay? Well, the good news on that front is that it will work. There's just a lot of evidence, and I'm a bit embarrassed even to admit this, but there's a huge literature within social science that shows that if you transfer cash to poor families, that will help them. This is my job. Millions and millions of dollars spent on that, but actually it's important to demonstrate that because in fact there was an earlier literature based on very bad methods that suggest that in fact cash didn't work. And what this newer literature has shown, based on the highest quality experimental and quasi-experimental methods, is that in fact, if you deliver cash to poor families, they will use that money to basically buy opportunity for their kids. And there'll be a big long-term payoff for their children if you can deliver cash when the children are young and even a bit older. So cash works, and in fact, this is exactly why in the UK, whatever you may think of Tony Blair, he embarked on a huge anti-poverty program that was basically founded on that result, that cash works. And so he delivered cash to poor families, and the evidence suggested that it had a huge payoff in all sorts of ways. But how long did that program last? As long as Blair was in power. And so now it's being dismantled. Okay? So the problem is that that kind of approach isn't all that legitimate. Just delivering cash, a cash transfer to the poor, is politically fragile. It requires a very complicated political coalition to sustain, and that coalition will potentially be dismantled quite quickly. And so that's a difficult way to go, and the evidence based on sentiments within California, which is a very liberal state, right, still suggests that direct cash transfers of that sort are going to be politically fragile. So that's the problem with this approach. It actually, you can craft a cash transfer program that will work. There's lots of evidence that, it's not like all types of cash transfer will work, but there are ways to make cash transfer work and work well. But it's going to be hard to sell. It probably wouldn't pass in California, even in California. So I'm going to put together an alternative approach just based on decommodification. So here, this is option 2. Here what you do is you identify the key junctures where there's not a level playing field, where opportunities for poor kids are different than those for rich kids. You've got to identify the most important junctures where that's the case, and then you deliver those services directly to poor kids in a way that allows them to compete on a more nearly equal footing. That's the game plan. Deliver equalizing services directly to those key junctures where there's inequality of opportunity. So the basic argument is that lots of things are well distributed by the market, goods and services. Lots of efficiencies to be had by virtue of using the market mechanism for the distribution and allocation of goods and services. That's wonderful. We're very good at that in this country, and we should celebrate that. But there's one thing that we really don't want to use the market to distribute, and that would be opportunity, because we have a deep commitment in this country to equal opportunity, that no matter how poor or rich your parents may be, everyone should have an opportunity. It shouldn't be the case that if your parents are rich, they can just buy opportunities for their kids, and eliminate the level playing field. We want a level playing field, A, because we're committed to that as a country, as the right and fair way to proceed. It's a country founded on that premise. But secondarily, it's grossly inefficient to allow rich parents to just basically buy opportunities for their kids, even though their kids might not merit those opportunities, right? So you're cutting off all the talent that happens to be available in poor families and saying you're just out of the game. You're not going to be matched to those jobs that would exploit those talents. So it's very inefficient for the economy, and it's also the wrong thing to do. So when it comes to opportunity, that's one thing we're going to take out of the market. We're going to decommodify, and we're going to say everyone's going to get opportunity for their kids. They may not take advantage of that opportunity, they may not be meritorious, and they may not do well, but they should at least have a chance. That's the game plan. So this is going to mean, in large part, you're going to equalize access to education. Not exclusively. We're going to talk about other ways in which opportunities are going to be equalized, but equalizing access to education is a pretty big deal. I don't think people realize how big it is. So here we show what the poverty rates are under 2 measures, the official poverty measure and the California poverty measure. But the poverty rates are for different levels of training, from less than high school to college. And you see basically that if you don't have a high school degree, about half of the kids are in poverty in California. And if you do have a college degree, it reduces to somewhere between 5 to 10%, depending on your poverty measure. So it's reduced by a factor of about 10. 5 to 10, depending on which measure. And so you get a huge bang for your buck by just getting more kids out of this zone, the low education zone, into the high education zone. Because all those kids are going to do better. They're likely to be out of poverty, right? So that's one obvious benefit of getting more kids into this side of the education training spectrum, right? That's obvious and simple. But there's another benefit, and our models, our simulations show this benefit to be very, very important. The other benefit is that even if you're one of the kids who doesn't take advantage of opportunities to go, say, to college, or to take advantage of vocational training, even if you're one of the kids who don't, you're still going to be much advantaged under this plan. Why? Because so many kids will have taken advantage of those opportunities that now there won't be this vast reserve army of labor down at the bottom of the training spectrum. So what we now have is huge numbers of poor kids with very little skills competing after a relatively small number of jobs that are available for those kids. So what happens in that case when you have many, many more workers than there are jobs vying for those jobs? Well, huge unemployment in that sector, in this low-skill sector, and very low wages. If we can siphon a lot of that labor off and put it over here, then the folks that remain down here will have much less competition. There'll be much lower unemployment among them, even if they don't get any college or any higher education. There'll be much less unemployment, and the wages will be much higher. Because now employers will have far fewer workers that are vying for those jobs, so they can't drive down wages as successfully. So it helps everyone, right? If we can just get labor over in this zone, well, I'll tell you, there's one group that doesn't help. These folks, right? Now there's going to be more competition over here. We can talk about that. So it's not like everyone comes out ahead. It's not a parade one. But many people will come out ahead. Bad for you. But I mean, just to follow up on that, folks like you and me who have a college education have been benefiting from basically being protected from competition for years and years. We're protected from competition from poor people. Yes, some poor people, some poor children are able to get through all the obstacles and still go to college. But most don't, and we're protected from that. And that's good for us, right? Because there are fewer folks competing for the jobs that are available for college trained labor, and that then means that we're, by virtue of this protection, these obstacles, these bottlenecks, our wages are higher than they would otherwise be. It's good for us, but it's not good for the economy. Okay, so what are we going to do? We want to identify, again, all those places where opportunities are unequal, and I'm going to talk in particular about 4 zones where there's unequal opportunities, where kids who grew up in poor families don't have the opportunities that kids who grew up in well-off families did. And then we're going to deliver those opportunities directly in each of those zones. So the basic game plan is to outfox the rich. So the rich spend promiscuously. They don't really need to know what sorts of investments in their children will have payoff. They can just spend, and then spend some more because they got lots of money. You're not sure if that finishing school vacation in Europe will really have a payoff and make it possible for your kid to go to college here, but why not? Maybe it will, and so you'll make that investment, you'll send your kid to Europe, and hope that it will improve their chances of going to college. And you can spend in all sorts of ways when you're rich, just to protect against the downside risk that your kid won't get into the top school. But when you're spending taxpayer money, this plan that we'll talk about is intended to do just that. So you got to be honest about it. It's taxpayer money. You got to make sure that when you make an investment, it's based on evidence that in fact that investment has payoff, right? So you can't be like the rich. You got to outfox them. You got to spend in a very targeted and precise and conservative way only on those sorts of interventions that you know have big payoff. So no finishing school vacations for the poor. Okay, so let's get to it now. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the actual plan because it's very, very standard stuff. It's stuff for which the evidence is overwhelming, okay? So first is home visiting. This is one of the featured programs of President Obama. It's basically intended to deliver information about healthy practices that isn't as available within poor populations as it is within well-off populations, and the evidence with respect to the effects on maternal and child health are pretty overwhelming, okay? So you can think about this. You think about this as a realistic approach to living in a highly segregated world. So if you grow up in a poor neighborhood, you don't have access to the types of networks that would deliver the information that you need about healthy practices in prenatal and postnatal period. That's just the implication of living in a really poor neighborhood. You don't have access to that information. So we have to deliver it artificially through a home visiting program for those families who want it. And the payoff is pretty substantial. So now you're going to have rich and poor kids with more nearly equal capacities because the poor families are now have available to them the same information that's been made available to rich families. So the capacities will be more nearly equal, but you have to build on that foundation. So you go to the next stage, which is to train in a more nearly equal way. And that means delivering early childhood education to all poor families. We now have some publicly funded, high-quality early childhood education available in California for poor families, but not nearly enough. And so what we're going to do is deliver to all poor families high-quality early childhood education. And the payoff to this, the research evidence for this is again very clear. There are some complications, and we can talk about that if you'd like, but the basic story is that there's a powerful, profound effect of delivering early childhood education in terms of opportunities. Now, I should say that this is a radical supply-side plan, but it can't be exclusively supply-side or it's not going to work. Let me just give you one example of why that's the case. Think about differences in chances for incarceration. If you look at neighborhoods in California, there are some neighborhoods where the chances for incarceration are sky high. Now, what would be the incentive for a child or family that's growing up in a neighborhood where chances of incarceration are sky high? What would be the incentive for taking advantage of improved opportunities for training? Well, they'd be much diminished, right? Because you know with very high likelihood your children are going to end up incarcerated, right? And so all that investment in education will be wasted because basically your child is going to be warehoused, right? So you need to make it clear that there's going to be a payoff to these investments, and that means eliminating disparate chances for incarceration. So it cannot be an exclusively supply-side plan. You have to make it clear that these investments have a realistic chance of actually delivering. Okay. So we talked about prenatal and postnatal period, equalizing chances for raising children in a healthy way. We talked about early childhood training and equalizing opportunities to access early childhood training of a high quality sort. And now we're moving on to later in the life course. And the old story with respect to these later interventions is that they're low payoff. But in fact, there's now all sorts of research which shows that there are some high payoff later interventions that can be had. And again, what we're doing here with these types of interventions is compensating for deep and profound economic segregation, in which poor people live with poor people, rich people live with rich people. It'd be far better if we were integrated, if we all lived together, then access to information would be more nearly equal. But we don't live in that world, and until we do, we have to figure out a way to create, in effect, artificial neighborhoods. And there's been a lot of research on this. And I'll just give you an example of what you can do in terms of a high payoff late intervention. It's an intervention that my colleague, Carolyn Hawksby, has championed and done path-breaking research demonstrating its power. This is what you do. You basically deliver through say, text messaging or email or some other social media. You deliver to poor kids who are very talented and have very high grades. You just deliver information on the types of colleges for which they would qualify and the kinds of financial aid that, if they were to be admitted, would likely be available to them. A simple information intervention. You might think they would know that already, but if you're in a neighborhood in which everyone is poor, you don't have access to that kind of information. You don't know that you could get to a college like this if you have the requisite grades and test scores. You just don't know that. So you don't apply to a place like this. You end up applying somewhere that's not nearly as good as it should be, and all that talent is not exploited to the extent that it should be. So this simple information intervention is sort of compensating again for the profound economic segregation that we have between people who don't have equal access to information. That's just one example. There are other later interventions too. Workforce development interventions that have been shown to be very effective. This is basically vocational training, but vocational training on steroids that works. We can talk about how that happens, but I'm going to skip over that. But I just want to make again the point that it can't be exclusively a supply-side plan. We also have to eliminate labor force discrimination of various sorts. Because again, if you're delivering all this opportunity for training, but the training doesn't have payoff because of discrimination in the labor force, then the incentive to undertake that training is reduced. And all of our simulations again show you've got to address this problem as well. It can't be an exclusively supply side intervention. So we put together, a group of us at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, put together an evidence-based plan that selected from among those programs that work, ones that would play out well in the context of California, and then adopt this decommodifying approach. And so that's it. We just wrote some papers that lay out what works and what doesn't work within the context of a decommodifying approach. We also wrote some papers that lay out what works and what doesn't work within the context of a cash transfer approach. And at this point, the political groups take it. We're a nonpartisan center. We just want to lay out what the evidence is. If you were to undertake an aggressive anti-poverty program in California, and the political groups are now taking over, and they are going to deliver a proposition in 2018 on California full vote. And so I'm just going to conclude with why I think that proposition is going to pass. This is just me as a citizen, not anything other than pass. Just my own observation about why I think it will pass. So first off, it's politically viable, and I talked about this already. If you focus group cash transfers in California, people don't like it. They think it's an illegitimate. I mean, people think they own their money, right? They think they earned it. That the state intervenes and takes their money and just gives it directly to others. That's seen as liberty denied. And so it's hard to sell cash transfers. And an easier sell, a far easier sell, is decommodifying opportunities. And this is in part because it's consistent with our values. We believe very deeply in this country in equal opportunity, that all kids, no matter how poor the families might be, should have a shot at getting ahead. They shouldn't be locked out just because their parents can't buy opportunity for them. This is an equal opportunity intervention, and so people can embrace it. That's consistent with some of their most fundamental values. It will yield, it also I think will pass because it will yield a substantial reduction in poverty. All of our simulations suggest that we can dramatically reduce poverty. And it's in part because we're treating it at the right scale. We're not deploying interventions that haven't been already deployed. This is staid stuff. You know, academics like to be creative and do new stuff. This isn't new stuff. This is standard stuff. It's standard stuff that's been shown to work. But then we just put it on steroids, right? We treat poverty at the right scale. Usually we just put very, very minimal funding into these anti-poverty programs. Funding that can't possibly be at the right level given the scale of the problem. This program that's going to be converted to proposition form is going to be big and massive, and it's going to address the problem at the right scale. It will be a permanent reduction in poverty because we're treating the problem at the source. It's not about the symptoms. It's about equalizing opportunities for training. People will be trained up, and then the problem will be over. It'll be done. It'll be an economy growing reform because we're increasing human capital investment. The natural niche of the California economy is a high human capital economy. And we'll be training people to exploit that natural niche. And finally, it's going to be a money-saving reform. Once this plays out, and it's going to take 20 years, you have to be honest about that. That's going to be a hard sell. There's just no getting around it. People want to solve poverty tomorrow. A lot of our initiatives are oriented with some sort of ridiculous dream that that's possible. This is going to take 20 years. You have to be honest and transparent about that. But once you do this, once you commit this major way, at the end of the day, we'll have a substantial reduction in safety nets. But the people will be in the economy. They'll be working. They'll be making money. We have much more money coming in through the coffers. They'll generate much more in the way of tax revenues. And as a bonus, much less safety net spending. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions.
I'm wondering, I know that your area of expertise is California, but in a state like Arkansas, for example, where we saw on the map that there are fewer opportunities for rising, I'm wondering like if this is kind of like a one size fits all approach, or if there are like certain adjustments that need to be made in the state in which the policies are going to be implemented.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in many ways, this type of plan with some tweaks would work in a state like this. The problem is I don't know this state as well as I should, but there's good reason to believe that it would work out. This plan was calibrated for the kinds of safety net programs that already are in play in California. So California already has a very strong home visiting program. And so it's relatively cost effective to ramp that program up. If we didn't have a home visiting program, we might have gone somewhere else rather than building something out of nothing. So I wouldn't want to ask how big the home visiting program is, say, in Arkansas. I don't know the answer to that. We also have a relatively well-developed regime for delivering high-quality early childhood education. It's vastly undersized, but we have the beginnings of what could be then developed and grown into something that would satisfy the needs among the poor population. So it's those sorts of considerations that led us to this kind of plan. And then you'd have just to ask questions about Arkansas, what sorts of investments have already been made and can be exploited going forward. But I think it probably would be something similar. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I have two questions. So my first one is how would you ensure that the standard of education would be, I guess, up to par with like, and I know you like suggested that you can have like this like the same amount of funding for all the schools. However, like would it be based on standardized tests in order to get into colleges, or what kinds of education? And would it be more of like a community-based education style, which is take into like the perspectives of those people in those communities that have different cultures and have different perspectives on life, and would take that into account when making these schools equally standardized as the other ones?
Yeah, another great question. So yeah, let me be a little clearer on how this will likely come down. So much of the money spent on early childhood education. So I didn't talk much about primary and secondary education, but rather early childhood education, because we know that there's huge payoff to those early investments. And we do have an existing machinery for delivering early childhood education in California. We just ramp that up and make it available to anyone who's poor who wants it. But you're talking about, I think, principally primary and secondary education. And in California, we were lucky because one of the great things that Governor Brown did was called the local control funding formula, which, well, it's somewhere here. Yeah, here we go. Local control funding formula, which I didn't talk about. So now you've given me the opportunity, thank you, to do that. And we could sort of ignore primary and secondary education because this is a huge experiment that's underway, just beginning in California, that will at least take the first steps towards equalizing funding across school districts. And a big problem in California is that if you're in a poor school district, you don't have nearly as much money available to you for primary and secondary school. This local control funding formula will rectify that, we hope. And the way in which it's rectified is, and this speaks to your concerns about local control, it will be consistent with the way in which that local school district thinks those extra funds can best be deployed. And likewise, throughout all of the features of this program that I talked about, the actual way in which it's delivered will be a function of what people in the local area think is the best way. So it's going to be very resonant with a promised neighborhoods approach, in which there's local control of the funding. Yeah.
So would these local controls have new appointed members that actually represent the populations that they control? So for example, school boards that are controlled by people that are not part of the community. And how would those new, like if there were to be new appointed members, how would they best, take, I guess, into account the general wants of the people in that area?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's a good and pointed question. So there's not any change in governance here. And so insofar as the existing governance system is flawed, and yes, it is, those sorts of problems will continue on. So we can't do everything. And yeah, so we're going to inherit all sorts of governance problems that are already in play. That's absolutely right. And that's a potential flaw. Yeah.
And my second question is...
One question?
So part of the answers that what I saw was reducing discrimination.
Yeah.
And my question is, how exactly would you propose to reduce discrimination based off of
Yeah.
sexuality, gender, or race?
Yeah. Well, in part, it's just enforcing the laws of the books, but the proposition will not, I have to confess, likely take that on. The propositions legally have to take on just one issue. And so it's a matter of enforcing what's on the books. At least if we did that, we would be a lot further along. But the proposition itself, again, I have to be honest about this, won't take that on. It just has to be taken on. And actually, our simulations show that if you don't do that, you got big problems. So I think you have to be transparent with the population that we have got to do this, or all of this expenditure won't yield the fruit that it has to yield. So, yeah, that's a prayer.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi. What would you advocate be done for like schools outside of school districts, like private schools? Because it seems to me that your plan is based off of a lot of equalizing funding for schools within school districts. But we all know there are pockets of areas where rich people can basically come and invest in these schools and make sure that no matter how equally funded the surrounding schools are, these private schools will always be better.
Yeah.
So what would your plan do about that? And if your plan can't challenge that, what do you think would be a good idea to approach that?
Yeah. So again, as in the local control funding formula, we're actually not dealing with the primary secondary school system in this particular initiative.
Right.
But nonetheless, your point is on the mark in the sense that there's nothing here that would prevent rich families from using their money to buy super high quality education for their kids, right? If I understand your point.
Yes.
And so that's absolutely right. And there are obviously limits to what you can do with taxpayer money. You're not going to be able to afford for everyone a super high quality education that the super rich can afford. So the hope is that if you can get the level up, and there's evidence behind it, so you get the level up to some very high standard, the incremental benefits in terms of unequal opportunity that accrue to even further increments in quality are relatively small. And it's something that poor kids can overcome. There's not going to be a level playing field. You're absolutely right. There won't be, absent some extraordinary revolution, right? But you can get the kinds of services that are delivered to poor kids up to a level that at least they have a real and decent shot at. So I think that would be what this does, yeah. It won't be equal, it won't be fair, it'll just be more nearly equal and more nearly fair.
Thank you.
You talked about public goods. An example that you gave was about caregiving, and you said that back in the day, everyone had a more equal opportunity for caregiving. But that's an idea that was kind of hard to grasp because I would say, like, maybe for the poor, like the mothers, you can assume that they lack a better education, and so in parallel to that, they couldn't provide for their children as much. And so I feel as if there was always an inequality there with caregiving.
Yeah. Well, if that's true, then the case for this type of intervention is yet stronger. Because we're going to deliver the same high quality early childhood education to all kids. Right? It's going to be standardized. Insofar as there are differences in the capacity to deliver high quality training across social classes, by virtue of delivering high quality early childhood education to all kids, those sorts of differentials will be reduced. So we should be very happy.
Yeah, I think it's probably palatable to most of us, the idea that early childhood education, Head Start, can increase educational outcomes. But you did mention that there were like complications with that, and I was wondering if you could kind of unpack that for us.
Yeah, great question. So the main complications are all about washout, and the evidence suggests that the benefits to some early childhood education, and one of the complications whether or not it's truly high quality, right? But the benefits to some types of early childhood education wash out over the years. And the controversy is about how to interpret that. And the argument that I think is carrying the day on that issue of washout is that in the past, when you didn't have much early childhood education, the schools were presented with lots of kids who were not very well prepared at all. And so then the difference between those who had an early childhood education and those who didn't was massive. But now, as you have more early childhood education, schools are able to concentrate the resources on a smaller number of kids and do a better job of it. And so that means that you get the appearance of washout, when actually it's schools now having fewer kids who are problematic, being able to concentrate the resources on that smaller number of kids and closing the gap, and that creates the appearance of washout. I think that's in a nutshell what the current wisdom on this is. But it is an issue that's still, to some extent, controversial. It's the one point where the evidence is perhaps not as great as you'd like.
I just have one more question.
So you talked a lot about how diversity of income in the neighborhood is a really important way of making sure that some people had a more even level of opportunity. And so I was wondering if you've seen any policies on the city level that have done a good job of diversifying the income in neighborhoods throughout your research.
Well, there's a big debate underway about why economic segregation is increasing and what's behind that. And lots of people think it's intimately connected to rising income inequality, but the evidence on that is still as yet unclear. Other folks think that what's driving it is a change in the way in which basically zoning practices have unfolded and a declining real commitment to basically mixed income development, as evidenced in zoning practices. But it's an open debate. This is an unresolved question. And so, yeah, that's a case actually where more research is warranted. I hate to say that, but we really don't know what's driving it. We do know that the effects of it are clear, but what's driving it is not clear. You don't need to necessarily know, by the way, what's driving it to repair it. The causes and the solutions don't necessarily have to line up. So I think we could get at it right now. I have lots of things we could do. But as to the causes, it's not quite going to say.
If we want to give a round of applause.